Plague of Athens. In 430 BCE, as Athens waged war against Sparta, a nightmare swept through the overcrowded city walls. The so-called Plague of Athens tore through Pericles' people, killing nearly a quarter of the population. Historians estimate 75,000 to 100,000 lives lost. Ancient accounts from Thucydides describe fever, thirst, ulcers, and rapid death, a mysterious illness scholars now suspect may have been typhoid fever. The toll shattered Athenian morale and weakened their war effort at the height of the Peloponnesian conflict. The disease didn't just kill soldiers and citizens, it crushed Athens' political leadership. Even Pericles himself succumbed. With their population gutted, Athens lost much of its military advantage, and historians argue that this plague permanently altered the balance of power in the ancient Mediterranean. A war that could have been an Athenian victory instead dragged into disaster, with disease shaping history as decisively as any Spartan spear. Antonine Plague. When Roman legions returned from campaigns in the east around 165 CE, they brought back more than spoils of war. They unleashed the Antonine Plague. Likely smallpox, this pandemic ravaged the empire for 15 years, killing 5 to 10 million people. Eyewitness physician Galen described fever, diarrhea, and a horrific skin eruption. With mortality rates devastating entire legions, the Roman army itself was gutted, and trade routes carried the infection from one province to another. The empire never truly recovered. Grain harvests failed, armies crumbled, and manpower shortages shook Rome's stability. Historians even argue this outbreak marked the beginning of Rome's long decline. What was once the most powerful empire in the world was brought to its knees, not by invading barbarians, but by an invisible killer carried home by its own soldiers. Plague of Cyprian. A century later, another plague struck Rome. This one so ferocious that contemporaries claimed 5,000 people died in a single day in the city. Known as the Plague of Cyprian after the Christian bishop who described its horrors, the disease raged for over a decade. Symptoms included bloody diarrhea, throat ulcers, and blindness, leading some modern scholars to suspect viral hemorrhagic fever or smallpox. This plague hit during a time of political chaos when Rome was already being torn apart by invasions and civil wars. The mass death crippled cities, emptied farmlands, and fueled religious shifts. Christianity spread in part because Christians cared for the sick when others abandoned them. The Plague of Cyprian wasn't just a health disaster, it changed the spiritual and cultural direction of the empire itself. By the way, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'll greatly appreciate it if you could show support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Thank you. Justinianic Plague. In 541 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire faced a killer that dwarfed all before it, the Justinianic Plague. Caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would later fuel the Black Death. This pandemic began in Egypt and spread across the Mediterranean, striking Constantinople with terrifying speed. Procopius, a historian of the time, claimed up to 10,000 people died per day in the capital. Scholars estimate tens of millions of deaths across several waves lasting into the 8th century. The devastation crippled Emperor Justinian's dreams of reuniting the Roman Empire. Armies collapsed, tax revenues shrank, and entire regions depopulated. For many historians, the Justinianic Plague was a turning point. It weakened Byzantium so severely that it never regained the dominance of Old Rome, leaving Europe vulnerable to centuries of upheaval. The Black Death. The most infamous pandemic of them all. The Black Death. Beginning in Central Asia and carried by trade routes, Yersinia pestis exploded into Europe in 1347, wiping out about a third of the continent's population in just a few years. That's at least 25 million dead in Europe alone, with the global toll much higher. People developed grotesque swellings called buboes, coughed blood, and died within days. Panic swept through villages as entire families disappeared overnight. The social and cultural fallout was enormous. Labor shortages broke the feudal system, peasant revolts erupted, and the Catholic Church's authority cracked under the weight of unanswered prayers. Art, literature, and even burial practices changed forever. The Black Death wasn't just a health crisis, it reshaped Europe's economy, religion, and future. Italian Plague. In the early 17th century, Italy faced one of its darkest hours. Between 1629 and 1631, the Italian plague, a deadly wave of bubonic plague, swept across the north. Cities like Milan, Venice, and Florence were ravaged, with Milan losing nearly half its people. Historians estimate 280,000 to 1 million deaths in just 2 years. Trade routes carried infected rats and fleas straight into Italy's bustling city-states, turning its commercial strength into a deadly weakness. The devastation was so complete that cultural and economic life nearly collapsed. Entire villages disappeared from the map, Venice imposed brutal quarantines, and religious processions turned into mass contagion events. The Italian plague permanently scarred the region's demographics and slowed its recovery for decades, marking it as one of Europe's most catastrophic outbreaks before the Black Death's return centuries later. Great Plague of London. In 1665, the last major outbreak of bubonic plague in England struck with terrifying force. Within 18 months, more than 100,000 people died, a quarter of the city's population. It began in the crowded slums of St. Giles, spreading rapidly as the summer heat drove fleas and rats into human homes. The rich fled to the countryside, leaving the poor trapped behind locked doors marked with red crosses. Lord, have mercy upon us. This disaster didn't just empty streets, it changed London's history. Commerce stalled, schools and theaters closed, and bodies piled so quickly that mass graves had to be dug outside the city. When the Great Fire of London followed in 1666, some believed it cleansed the city of the plague, but the truth is that modern sanitation and pest control were centuries away. The Great Plague was London's brutal farewell to medieval disease. Great Plague of Marseille. In 1720, a merchant ship named the Grand Saint-Antoine docked with hidden cargo, plague-infected fleas. Within weeks, France's busiest Mediterranean port collapsed into chaos. The Great Plague of Marseille killed about 50,000 people in the city and another 50,000 across Provence. Entire households were wiped out, with survivors forced to burn contaminated furniture and clothing to stop the spread. The outbreak was so feared that Marseille's port was sealed off by massive walls and armed guards. Trade routes across Europe shunned the region, causing an economic crash. Though the plague had devastated Europe for centuries, this outbreak was its final catastrophic strike in Western Europe, marking the end of an era of medieval-style epidemics. First, cholera pandemic. In 1817, a new killer emerged: cholera. It began in the Ganges Delta of Bengal, India, before spreading along trade and military routes across Asia, reaching as far as the Middle East and East Africa. Known as the first cholera pandemic, it killed hundreds of thousands. Soldiers described entire regiments collapsing within days, their bodies racked by vomiting, diarrhea, and dehydration so extreme it turned skin blue. This was the first time the world faced cholera on a global scale. British colonial expansion and shipping lanes carried the disease far beyond India, setting the stage for a century of recurring pandemics. The first cholera pandemic shattered confidence in traditional medicine, forcing doctors to confront the terrifying reality of waterborne disease. Second cholera pandemic. Barely a decade later, cholera struck again, this time harder. The second cholera pandemic began in India and tore across Europe, Russia, and the Americas. For the first time, cholera reached London, Paris, and New York, killing hundreds of thousands. In 1832, New York City lost over 3,500 residents in just a few months. Panic led to riots in cities where the poor accused governments of poisoning wells. This pandemic was pivotal for public health. It exposed how filthy urban water supplies fueled mass death. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick in England began pushing for sanitation reform, linking clean water to survival. Though millions perished, the second cholera pandemic forced governments to recognize disease prevention as a civic duty, not just a medical problem. Third cholera pandemic. The deadliest of the 19th century cholera waves hit in 1852. Known as the Third Cholera Pandemic, it spread from India into Europe, Africa, and the Americas, killing over 1 million worldwide. Cities from London to Cairo reeled under the devastation. In London, 1854 became infamous when Dr. John Snow mapped an outbreak to a single contaminated water pump on Broad Street. a landmark moment that proved cholera was waterborne, not spread by miasma. This discovery would change medicine forever. Snow's work became the foundation of modern epidemiology, but at the time, people were dying faster than reforms could take hold. In Russia alone, more than 1 million lives were lost, while the disease crippled trade and filled cities with mass graves. The third cholera pandemic was a disaster, but it also forced the birth of scientific public health. The fourth cholera pandemic began with Muslim pilgrims traveling to Mecca in 1863, turning a sacred journey into a global health catastrophe. Within years, cholera spread across the Middle East, Europe, Africa, and North America, killing hundreds of thousands. Egypt reported 60,000 deaths in a single year, and outbreaks ripped through Europe's industrial cities where sewage systems were still primitive. This wave revealed how globalization, shipping, migration, and pilgrimage could transform one region's outbreak into a worldwide disaster. The death toll is estimated in the millions, and the pandemic finally forced governments like Britain's to build major sewer and clean water systems. The fourth cholera pandemic wasn't just about death, it was about the realization that sanitation could save entire populations. The fifth cholera pandemic. By the late 19th century, cholera struck again. The fifth pandemic. Beginning in Egypt in 1881, it spread rapidly across Europe and Asia. Hamburg, Germany, became the symbol of this wave in 1892, when more than 8,600 people died within a matter of weeks. The outbreak was so devastating it caused a scandal that toppled city officials who had ignored calls to modernize the water system. This pandemic taught a harsh lesson. Science had advanced, but political negligence killed. In cities with clean water and functioning sewers, cholera's grip weakened. But in poorly governed urban centers, the disease still spread like wildfire. By the end of this pandemic, governments around the world began to accept responsibility for sanitation as a matter of survival. The sixth cholera pandemic erupted from India in 1899 and swept into the Middle East, Russia, and parts of Europe, lasting until the 1920s. It killed over 800,000 people in India alone and devastated regions like Persia and the Ottoman Empire. Unlike earlier waves, Western Europe and North America were largely spared thanks to cleaner water systems, showing how modernization created a shield against mass death. Yet, in less developed regions, the devastation was staggering. Refugees, soldiers, and poor sanitation fueled outbreaks during World War I, and the pandemic lingered in Russia until 1923. For many, the sixth cholera pandemic highlighted the brutal divide between nations that had embraced sanitation reform and those still trapped in deadly vulnerability. Third plague pandemic. While cholera haunted the 19th century, another old killer returned: plague. In 1855, an outbreak began in Yunnan, China, and spread worldwide in what became known as the Third Plague Pandemic. Carried by rats and fleas aboard ships, it ravaged India, where more than 10 million died, and devastated China's port cities. In total, at least 12 million people perished before the waves ended around 1960. Unlike medieval times, this pandemic gave birth to modern bacteriology. In 1894, Alexandre Yersin identified Yersinia pestis as the culprit, proving at last what caused plague. This discovery marked the beginning of modern plague research and vaccines. But despite scientific progress, the pandemic's century-long shadow showed how a single bacterium could still bring empires to their knees: the Spanish flu. In the final year of World War I, the deadliest pandemic in modern history struck: the 1918 influenza, known as the Spanish flu. This H1N1 virus didn't just kill the elderly, it struck young, healthy adults with terrifying speed. Lungs filled with fluid, victims turned blue from lack of oxygen, and death often came within days. In just 2 years, the pandemic infected about a third of the world's population and killed at least 50 million people, with some estimates pushing much higher. The timing magnified its devastation. War-weary nations were already weakened, and troop movements helped spread the virus worldwide. Cities imposed quarantines, schools shut down, and public gatherings were banned, measures familiar today. The 1918 flu didn't just scar a generation, it redefined public health and remains the yardstick against which every pandemic is measured. Asian flu. 4 decades later, influenza struck again, this time with the Asian flu. Caused by an H2N2 strain, it began in southern China in 1957 and spread across the globe within months. The pandemic killed between 1 and 4 million people worldwide. In the US alone, more than 100,000 lives were lost. Unlike the 1918 strain, this virus hit in 2 distinct waves, first in 1957 and again in 1958, catching governments off guard. What changed was the response. Scientists identified the strain quickly, and vaccines were developed within months, a first in history. While the pandemic still killed millions, it showed that modern science could blunt the blow of influenza. The Asian flu proved that humanity had entered a new era, one where pandemics could still kill on a massive scale, but where medicine could finally fight back. Hong Kong flu. In 1968, influenza mutated again, this time into the H3N2 strain known as the Hong Kong flu. The outbreak began in July in Hong Kong, and within months, it spread globally, killing about 1 million people. In the United States, it claimed around 100,000 lives, mostly among the elderly. Unlike 1918, modern hospitals and antibiotics to treat secondary infections helped keep the toll lower, but the virus still spread rapidly through crowded cities and schools. The Hong Kong flu was a sobering reminder that influenza evolves constantly and new strains can emerge without warning. Its arrival reinforced the need for yearly flu vaccines and ongoing surveillance. Though it lacked the catastrophic scale of 1918, this pandemic was another global shock, proving that influenza remained a persistent and unpredictable threat in the modern age. Swine flu. In 2009, the world faced a new strain of H1N1 influenza, quickly dubbed swine flu. It emerged in Mexico in April and spread with alarming speed, infecting millions within weeks. While the case fatality rate was lower than 1918, the global impact was still huge. The World Health Organization declared it a pandemic in June 2009, and by the end, estimates suggest between 151,000 and 575,000 people had died worldwide. What made this pandemic unique was its demographic profile. Like 1918, it struck younger adults and children harder than the elderly. Mass vaccination campaigns followed, though rollout was uneven across countries. The 2009 H1N1 pandemic revealed just how quickly a virus could circle the globe in the age of air travel, and it tested modern preparedness like no pandemic since the Spanish flu. Coccolizli epidemic. In the mid-16th century, colonial Mexico was struck by a mysterious killer the Aztecs called Coccolizli. Beginning in 1545, the epidemic wiped out between 5 and 15 million people, up to 80% of the indigenous population. Victims suffered high fevers, jaundice, bleeding from the eyes, and death within days. For centuries, the cause was unknown, but modern DNA studies point to Salmonella enterica paratyphi C, a bacterial infection spread through contaminated water and worsened by drought and famine. The Coccolizli epidemic was one of the most catastrophic outbreaks in the Americas, second only to smallpox in its impact. It shattered indigenous societies already reeling from conquest, collapsing cities and civilizations. For Mexico, this wasn't just a health disaster. It was a demographic catastrophe that reshaped the cultural and political landscape forever. The Great Dying. When Europeans arrived in the Americas, they didn't just bring guns and steel. They carried invisible weapons. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other old-world diseases swept through indigenous populations who had no immunity. From the Caribbean islands to the heart of Mexico and the Andes, entire civilizations crumbled. Historians estimate that in the first century after Columbus, up to 90% of the native population, tens of millions of people, perished. This Great Dying was one of the largest demographic collapses in human history. Empires like the Aztec and Inca fell not only to Spanish armies, but to waves of smallpox outbreaks that struck their cities before battles were even fought. The devastation reshaped the Americas, paving the way for European colonization while erasing centuries of indigenous culture and life. HIV/AIDS pandemic. First identified in 1981, HIV/AIDS quickly became one of the deadliest pandemics of modern times. What began with mysterious cases of immune collapse in young men in the US spread into a global crisis. By 2025, HIV/AIDS will have killed more than 44 million people worldwide, with over 600,000 deaths still occurring annually. Sub-Saharan Africa has borne the heaviest burden, where entire generations were lost and societies reshaped by the epidemic. The early years were marked by fear, stigma, and government inaction, but medical breakthroughs changed the landscape. Antiretroviral therapy transformed HIV from a death sentence into a manageable condition. Still, the struggle continues. Millions remain without access to treatment, and the pandemic serves as a reminder of how social inequality and disease are deeply intertwined. Ebola outbreak. Between 2014 and 2016, West Africa faced the largest Ebola outbreak ever recorded. Beginning in Guinea, the Ebola virus swept into Liberia and Sierra Leone, killing over 11,000 people. Patients suffered fever, vomiting, internal bleeding, and organ failure, with fatality rates as high as 70%. Healthcare systems collapsed under the strain, and fear spread faster than the virus itself. International response was slow at first, but when it came, doctors, aid workers, and even militaries rushed in to contain the crisis. Quarantines, experimental vaccines, and contact tracing eventually curbed the outbreak. While its death toll was smaller than historic plagues, Ebola's horror lay in its brutality. Entire families and communities wiped out in weeks. COVID-19 pandemic. In late 2019, a new coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, China, SARS-CoV-2. Within months, the world was shut down. Borders closed, cities locked down, and hospitals filled with patients struggling to breathe. By 2021, the World Health Organization estimated nearly 15 million excess deaths tied to COVID-19, making it one of the most catastrophic pandemics in human history. Even with vaccines developed at record speed, the virus spread through wave after wave, evolving into new variants. The pandemic reshaped modern life. Global economies froze, schools shifted online, and mental health crises soared. It revealed stark inequalities in healthcare access and forced governments to confront how unprepared the world truly was. COVID-19 wasn't just a health crisis, it was a turning point for the 21st century, a reminder that pandemics are not relics of the past, but ever-present threats. If you enjoyed this video, I'm going to be posting a lot more interesting videos on the channel. I'd greatly appreciate it if you could like and subscribe. Thank you very much.